我宣布，安全理事会，OK。我宣布，安全理事会第9863次会议现在开始。本次会议的临时议程是有关刚果民主共和国的局势。议程通过。按照安理会暂行议事规则第37条，我邀请安哥拉、布隆迪、刚果民主共和国、肯尼亚、卢旺达、南非、津巴布韦和马拉维代表参加本次会议。就这样决定。我代表安理会欢迎刚果民主共和国国务部长兼外交、国际合作和法语国家事务部长卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下。No interpretation?按照安理会暂行议事规则第39条，我邀请下列人员参加本次会议，通报情况。刚果民主共和国问题秘书长特别代表兼联合国组织刚果民主共和国稳定特派团团长凯塔女士，秘书长大湖区问题特使夏黄先生。就这样决定。安全理事会现在开始审议议程项目2。我现在请凯塔女士通报情况。
Monsieur le Président, distingués membres du Conseil de sécurité, Madame la ministre d'État, ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République démocratique du Congo, Thérèse Kaikamba-Wagner, le représentant permanent de la République du Rwanda, Ernest Ramucho, le représentant permanent de la République d'Angola, chers collègues Wangsha, envoyé spécial du secrétaire général pour la région des Grands Lacs, et tous les autres membres permanents, tous les autres ambassadeurs qui ont rejoint pour cette session. Je vous remercie d'avoir convoqué une autre session urgente du Conseil relative aux récents développements dans l'Est de la République démocratique du Congo et la nécessité de trouver une voie de sortie d'une crise qui représente une menace claire pour la paix et la stabilité de la région des Grands Lacs. Cette session se tient dans un contexte marqué notamment par la nomination du nouveau président de l'Union africaine lors du sommet du 15 février. Je tiens à féliciter Son Excellence le président de l'Angola, João Lourenço, médiateur de l'Union africaine dans le cadre du processus de Luanda. Je souhaite que son mandat soit marqué par le silence définitif des armes sur le continent. En dépit des multiples appels internationaux à un cessez-le-feu et à la cessation des offensives, le M23, soutenu par l'armée rwandaise, a continué sa progression dans les provinces du Nord-Kivu et Sud-Kivu. Cette avancée a eu des conséquences dévastatrices, entraînant la perte de nombreuses vies humaines lors de la prise de contrôle de Goma. En 2 semaines, l'Alliance Fleuve Congo, dont le M23 est une des principales composantes, a établi une administration parallèle à Goma avec la désignation d'un gouverneur et d'un maire. Au Sud-Kivu, le M23 s'est emparé de l'aéroport de Kavumu et de la ville de Bukavu, la capitale de chef-lieu de la province le 16 février. Le M23 a depuis continué son avancée et s'est emparé hier de la ville de Kamanyola, qui est à la hauteur du point de jonction des 3 frontières entre la République démocratique du Congo, le Rwanda et le Burundi. Depuis la prise de Goma, le M23 impose de sévères restrictions sur la liberté de mouvement de la MONUSCO, empêchant les efforts visant à évaluer les dégâts à l'aéroport de Goma et à aider à l'élimination en toute sécurité des munitions non explosées dans la ville. Le M23 a également empêché la MONUSCO à réapprovisionner en eau et autres produits de première nécessité les troupes de la mission de la communauté de développement de l'Afrique australe en République démocratique du Congo, SAMI RDC. De plus, le M23 contrôle toutes les routes entrant ou sortant des zones sous sa domination. Cela pose de sérieux défis au personnel civil et en uniforme de la MONUSCO pour les rotations essentielles à la mise en œuvre de son mandat, dont la priorité est la protection de la population civile. Par ailleurs, les infrastructures essentielles de la MONUSCO à Goma et dans d'autres localités du Nord-Kivu sont soumises à une pression extrême. Elles abritent des personnes qui s'y sont réfugiées pour bénéficier de la protection de la mission conformément au droit humanitaire international. Cependant, ces installations n'ont jamais été conçues ni équipées pour héberger un grand nombre de personnes sur une longue durée. La situation est d'autant plus critique que les conditions sanitaires et d'hygiène se détériorent rapidement et posent un risque à la fois pour les protégés et le personnel de la MONUSCO. Cette problématique alimente la désinformation et est utilisée afin d'amplifier les sentiments anti-MONUSCO. Monsieur le Président, la situation des droits humains dans le Nord et le Sud-Kivu s'est considérablement détériorée. Outre les cas de décès dus au combat entre M23 et les forces de sécurité de la République démocratique du Congo, la MONUSCO a également documenté des cas de recrutement forcé. On observe encore des mouvements continus des personnes déplacées autour de Goma. La plupart des anciens sites ont été démantelés et pillés par les communautés d'accueil et les personnes déplacées. Celles-ci se dirigent soit vers leur zone d'origine, soit vers de nouveaux centres collectifs autour de Goma. Même si des incertitudes demeurent quant aux circonstances exactes de ces déplacements secondaires, les conditions d'un retour sûr, volontaire, informé et digne, en conformité avec les principes internationaux, pourraient ne pas être garanties. De plus, nous avons enregistré de multiples perquisitions d'hôpitaux et de maisons par le M23 à la recherche de soldats et de civils perçus comme opposés au groupe. Le Bureau conjoint des Nations unies aux droits de l'homme reçoit quotidiennement des demandes de protection individuelle émanant de divers acteurs sociaux, y compris des défenseurs des droits humains. Ces derniers se trouvent souvent confrontés à des menaces et à des risques de représailles du M23 dans les zones sous son contrôle. Mr. President, the M23's offensive in North Kivu and South Kivu has increased the vulnerability of girls and women to conflict-related sexual violence, mass displacement, the influx of combatants and prisoners, and the proliferation of weapons have considerably exacerbated the risk. At the same time, logistical and security constraints continue to hamper the United Nations' ability to verify reported cases. In South Kivu, fighting in the Haut Plateau caused a high number of injured. Medical supplies need to be transported to Ivira to be able to assist the wounded. The situation is calm in Bukavu, where humanitarian actors are resuming their activities. Humanitarian response continues in Idwi, where over 100,000 displaced people arrived in January, as well as in Minova, where around 200,000 displaced people are staying with host families. Humanitarian actors must continue to have access and be able to do their work unhindered to keep assisting this vulnerable population. Monsieur le Président, je salue les conclusions du sommet conjoint de la Communauté d'Afrique de l'Est, ISI, et de la Communauté de développement de l'Afrique australe, SADC, sur la situation dans l'Est de la République démocratique du Congo qui s'est tenu le 8 février en Tanzanie. Ce sommet a réaffirmé l'appel à la cessation des hostilités et à un cessez-le-feu immédiat. Le sommet a également insisté sur la reprise des négociations directes et du dialogue avec toutes les parties étatiques et non étatiques, y compris le M23, dans le cadre des processus de Luanda et de Nairobi. Il a en outre réaffirmé la demande de neutralisation des FDLA et le retrait des troupes rwandaises du sol congolais. Il est impératif que les dispositions du communiqué du sommet ISI-SADC relatives au rétablissement des services publics essentiels, la réouverture immédiate de l'aéroport de Goma et des principales voies de ravitaillement, y compris sur le lac Kivu, soient mises en œuvre sans délai afin de soulager la souffrance de la population. J'encourage les chefs d'état-major des pays de l'ISI et de la SADC à se réunir incessamment afin de définir les modalités pour la mise en œuvre du cessez-le-feu ainsi que les mesures urgentes prévues dans le communiqué. Outre la réouverture de l'aéroport de Goma, demandée par le sommet, celle de l'aéroport de Kavumu serait également essentielle. Les Nations Unies, y compris la MONUSCO, restent déterminées à appuyer tout effort visant à ramener les parties à la table de négociation afin de trouver des solutions politiques durables à cette crise qui risque d'embraser la région tout entière. À cet égard, il est important de rappeler les progrès significatifs réalisés au cours des derniers mois dans le cadre du processus de Luanda. Il est crucial, comme le souligne le communiqué de la Réunion du Conseil paix et sécurité de l'Union africaine qui s'est tenue à Addis Abeba le 14 février dernier, que ces acquis ne soient pas perdus. Mr. President, it is imperative that this Council takes urgent and decisive steps to avert a wider regional war. I call on this Council to hold the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses in the Democratic Republic of Congo accountable. In this regard, I welcome the adoption by the Human Rights Council on 7 February of a resolution establishing a fact-finding mission to be followed by an independent commission of inquiry to investigate and document violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in the Eastern DRC. Finally, I call on all parties to uphold their obligations to protect civilians in full compliance with international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This includes the inviolability of United Nations premises and installations in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the safety and security of individuals under MONUSCO's protection. Thank you for your kind attention.
我感谢凯塔女士所做的通报。下面我请夏黄先生通报情况。
主席先生，尊敬的安理会成员，感谢各位邀请我围绕民主刚果共和国东部地区近期形势发展，通报地区形势情况。当前的严峻事态，急需各方予以共同关注，并迅即采取一致的应对举措。À la fin du mois de janvier, nous avons assisté à une répétition troublante de l'histoire lorsque le mouvement du 23 mars, M23, soutenu par les forces de défense rwandaises, a de nouveau pris d'assaut la ville de Goma. Aujourd'hui, après seulement 3 semaines, le même M23 contrôle Bukavu et si nos informations sont correctes, continue d'avancer vers d'autres zones stratégiques au nord et au Sud-Kivu. À ce stade, nous ne connaissons pas les intentions profondes du M23 et de leur soutien, jusqu'où ils iront et pourquoi. Mais ce que nous savons au regard des développements de ces dernières semaines, des actes posés sur le terrain et des discours publics des acteurs de la région, c'est que le risque d'un embrasement régional est plus que jamais réel. Cette situation doit s'arrêter avant que se déclenche une guerre régionale généralisée dont les conséquences seront catastrophiques à maints égards. Nous devons donc tous redoubler d'efforts pour éviter de saper tous les efforts consentis lors de la dernière décennie visant la stabilité, la coopération et l'intégration des pays de la région des Grands Lacs. Monsieur le Président, distingués membres du Conseil, je salue les pays et les organisations de la région qui se sont mobilisés pour répondre rapidement à la crise à travers notamment la tenue des sommets de la communauté de l'Afrique de l'Est, CAE, de la communauté de développement de l'Afrique australe, SADC, de la conférence des chefs d'État de la communauté économique des États de l'Afrique centrale, CEEAC, sur la situation humanitaire tenue à Malabo, et aussi le sommet conjoint de la CAE-SADC. Tous ces sommets ont unanimement souligné l'importance cruciale de respecter l'intégrité territoriale de la RDC. Ils ont fermement condamné l'offensive du M23 ainsi que le soutien qui lui est accordé, tout en insistant sur la nécessité de trouver rapidement une solution politique et diplomatique à la crise. À cet égard, le sommet conjoint CAE-SADC marque une étape clé dans l'émergence d'une approche régionale enfin coordonnée, concertée et unifiée, posant les prémices d'une résolution consensuelle de la crise dans l'est de la RDC. Le sommet conjoint a mis l'accent sur la nécessité d'une solution politique en appelant à la reprise des négociations directes et du dialogue avec toutes les parties prenantes. Il a également appelé à la fusion des processus de Nairobi et de Luanda en vue de renforcer la coordination et la complémentarité et à la création d'un mécanisme de coordination au niveau des secrétariats. En outre, le Conseil de paix et de sécurité de l'Union africaine, réuni au niveau des chefs d'État le 14 février dernier, a entériné les décisions du sommet conjoint CAE-SADC tout en rappelant la nécessité de respecter la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de la RDC et en condamnant les activités du M23 et de ses soutiens. Le Conseil de paix et de sécurité a aussi appelé à un renforcement de la coordination, à un soutien technique et à la mise en place de mécanismes de financement en vue d'appuyer les efforts de paix. Il importe maintenant de procéder à une mise en œuvre rapide et efficace des directives de tous ces sommets. Je suis heureux de noter ici que les préparatifs de la réunion des chefs d'état-major de la CAE et de la SADC sont en cours et que la réunion pourrait avoir lieu dans les prochains jours. Par ailleurs, les secrétariats de ces deux organisations régionales, ainsi que la Commission de l'Union africaine, assurent pour leur part le suivi de la décision de mettre en place un mécanisme conjoint technique de coordination. Des consultations sont également en cours entre les États membres concernés afin de définir les modalités de la fusion des processus de Nairobi et de Luanda, notamment la nomination éventuelle de facilitateurs supplémentaires pour renforcer la coordination et la cohérence. C'est l'occasion pour moi d'en appeler à la prise en compte de l'inclusion des femmes dans ces mécanismes de médiation conformément à l'engagement commun sur la participation des femmes. De même, je voudrais saluer le rôle joué par les acteurs de la société civile congolaise, en particulier les leaders religieux qui n'ont ménagé aucun effort ces dernières semaines pour consulter l'ensemble des acteurs afin de les ramener à la table du dialogue. Toutes ces démarches sont encourageantes, mais il faut qu'elles soient soutenues et suivies des faits. J'ai, pour ma part, entamé des consultations avec tous les acteurs impliqués pour encourager la coordination et la mise en œuvre rapide des dispositions convenues. Celles-ci sont indispensables pour parvenir à une désescalade de la situation sur le terrain, à soutenir l'aide humanitaire, la protection des femmes et des filles victimes de violences et à garantir la reprise d'un dialogue impliquant toutes les parties prenantes conformément aux décisions des chefs d'État. Je continuerai dans les prochains jours mes engagements auprès des acteurs de la région pour les encourager dans leurs efforts et réitérer le soutien politique et technique des Nations Unies. Monsieur le Président, distingués membres du Conseil, aussi dramatique que la situation nous paraisse aujourd'hui, elle peut encore s'aggraver. 12 ans après la signature de l'accord cadre et 19 ans après celle du pacte de la conférence internationale sur la région des Grands Lacs, l'histoire se répète malheureusement. Nous devons agir maintenant, agir vite, de manière collective et résolue. Comme l'a rappelé notre secrétaire général, nous devons rapidement s'assurer de la mise en œuvre de ces 3 priorités immédiates. Premièrement, la désescalade par un cessez-le-feu immédiat et le respect par toutes les parties du droit international et des engagements pris dans le cadre des mécanismes régionaux et internationaux, y compris l'accord cadre d'Addis Abeba. Ce dernier instrument exige en effet de ne pas tolérer ni fournir une assistance ou un soutien quelconque à des groupes armés et de respecter la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale des États voisins. L'arrêt des hostilités est urgent pour répondre aux conséquences humanitaires désastreuses ainsi que sur les droits de l'homme afin de créer les conditions nécessaires à un dialogue constructif. Deuxièmement, la relance du dialogue. On ne le dira jamais assez. La solution est politique et non militaire. Le dialogue et le compromis sont nécessaires pour trouver une solution durable. De ce fait, j'exhorte toutes les parties à se remettre autour de la table et à s'appuyer sur les dispositions déjà agréées par les parties dans le cadre des processus de Luanda et de Nairobi ou de ce qu'il en advienne conformément aux décisions des chefs d'État de la région. J'exhorte toutes les parties à s'engager de bonne foi dans ces efforts de paix et à les soutenir car ils sont essentiels pour résoudre la crise et éviter une guerre régionale. Travaillons ensemble pour rétablir le cessez-le-feu, restaurer l'autorité territoriale de la RDC, traiter définitivement la question des FDLR et celle du M23 en vue de garantir les préoccupations sécuritaires de toutes les parties. Je ne crois pas que ces points soient irréconciliables et il est temps aujourd'hui de s'asseoir à nouveau à la table des négociations et de discuter franchement des causes profondes de ce conflit. Et troisièmement, une approche régionale holistique pour justement traiter des causes profondes de ce conflit. La région doit favoriser une approche holistique qui combine des démarches immédiates et de moyen et de long terme. Dans ce contexte, il est important de poursuivre et de conclure le processus de revitalisation de l'accord cadre d'Addis Abeba comme outil crucial et de s'attaquer une fois pour toutes aux causes profondes de l'instabilité dans la région du Grand Lac. Je saisis cette opportunité pour réitérer mon appel à la convocation urgente de la prochaine réunion de haut niveau du mécanisme régional de suivi, au cours de laquelle les chefs d'État des pays concernés seront appelés non seulement à exprimer leur soutien unanime aux efforts de paix pour mettre fin à la crise en cours, mais également à se prononcer sur les recommandations visant à revitaliser l'accord cadre pour une mise en œuvre intégrale et sincère. Je voudrais conclure, Monsieur le Président, avec un appel direct aux membres de ce Conseil qui doit aussi user de tout son poids pour tenter de mettre fin à la crise. Une action robuste et unifiée de ce Conseil est en effet essentielle pour éviter un point de non-retour et pour convaincre les parties de reprendre le chemin du dialogue pour rétablir la paix et la sécurité dans la région des Grands Lacs. Je vous remercie.
我感谢夏黄先生所做的通报。我现在请想发言的安理会成员发言。我现在请法国代表发言。
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général ainsi que l'envoyé spécial pour les Grands Lacs pour leur présentation. Je salue la présence de la ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République démocratique du Congo. Le Conseil de sécurité se réunit une nouvelle fois en raison de la détérioration continue de la situation dans l'est de la République démocratique du Congo. Après Goma, il y a 3 semaines, le M23 a pris l'aéroport de Kavumu et Bukavu samedi dernier et il continue son offensive dans le Sud-Kivu. Le risque de guerre régionale augmente chaque jour. La France condamne l'offensive du M23 permise par le soutien actif du Rwanda. Les combats en cours aggravent une situation humanitaire dramatique marquée par le déplacement forcé d'1 million de personnes. Ces combats s'accompagnent d'attaques contre les populations, en particulier de violences sexuelles et de violences contre les enfants. Les Nations Unies ont recensé 2900 morts lors de la première semaine de l'offensive. Le Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme a confirmé hier des cas d'exécution sommaire d'enfants par le M23 à Bukavu. Celui-ci doit donc cesser immédiatement son offensive et se retirer des territoires dont il a pris le contrôle. Le soutien aux groupes armés par toutes les parties doit cesser. Les forces rwandaises de défense doivent se retirer sans délai du territoire de la République démocratique du Congo. La France condamne aussi les attaques du M23 contre la MONUSCO, les entraves à l'exercice de son mandat et les actions déstabilisatrices menées à son encontre. La liberté de mouvement et d'action de la MONUSCO doit être garantie. Les attaques contre les casques bleus, ainsi que des civils et des personnels humanitaires, sont susceptibles de constituer des crimes de guerre. La France réaffirme son plein soutien à la MONUSCO. Il n'y a pas d'issue militaire au conflit. La priorité va à un cessez-le-feu qui soit respecté et à la reprise du dialogue. La France salue la mobilisation régionale lors du dernier sommet du Conseil de paix et de sécurité de l'Union africaine, ainsi que du sommet conjoint de la communauté d'Afrique de l'Est et de la communauté de développement d'Afrique australe. Elle soutient ces efforts et souligne le rôle clé des processus régionaux de médiation. Les acquis du processus de Luanda demeure essentielle pour avancer vers un règlement qui passe par le retrait des troupes rwandaises du territoire congolais et le démantèlement des forces démocratiques de libération du Rwanda. La France appelle l'ensemble des groupes armés, dont le M23, à déposer les armes et à reprendre le dialogue. Le Conseil de sécurité doit apporter une réponse à la hauteur de la situation pour mettre fin aux hostilités, réaffirmer un soutien ferme à l'intégrité territoriale et la souveraineté congolaise, appuyer les efforts de la MONUSCO et créer les conditions favorables au dialogue. La France a proposé il y a déjà 2 semaines un projet de résolution en ce sens. Nous espérons que l'esprit de responsabilité des membres de ce Conseil permettra d'adopter cette résolution dans les meilleurs délais. Je vous remercie.
我感谢法国代表的发言，下面我请索马里代表发言。
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of A3, Algeria, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Somalia. We would like to thank the SRSG, Madame Bintou Keita, and Special Envoy Secretary General, Mr. Huang Sha, for their insightful briefings on the current situation in Eastern DRC. We salute the dedication and the services of MONUSCO, particularly the peacekeepers and all other operational personnel who continue to tirelessly support the Congolese people. We also acknowledge the crucial contribution of Symmetric personnel and welcome the participation of Her Excellency Teresa Kayakwamba Wagner, the State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and the Francophone of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We also welcome the representatives of Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa in this meeting. The A3 welcomes the convening of today's meeting, which affords the Security Council the opportunity to take stock on the recent development in the DRC since we last met to discuss the situation. At the outset, in light of the unfolding situation in the last few weeks, the A3 wishes to express its solidarity with the communities of Eastern DRC, from Masisi to Sake, Goma, and Bukavu. These communities are living in a constant fear as the M23 advances, with no clear sense of what the future holds. The resilience in the face of such uncertainty is commendable, yet their fate remains unclear. The threat of complete chaos that could degenerate into catastrophic violence is still very real, and people are not sure whether they will be able to return to their fields and grow their crops, or whether they will need to flee once again in the case of further violence. The A3 calls for calm and urges all parties to ensure that no further escalation of violence takes place in Eastern DRC. Mr. President, in light of the development on the ground right now, A3 wishes to make these 3 points. First, in addition to the continuing violence still persisting in the areas controlled by the M23, the A3 is also concerned by the continued escalation of violence in other localities, including Lubumbashi, Kisangani, and Uvira, coupled with the absence of MONUSCO and the mission's inability to operate in these areas. We therefore strongly reiterate our call for M23 to cease hostilities and stop its violence and advance and capture of more territories. We also call on M23 to lift its severe restrictions of MONUSCO's freedoms movement, preventing efforts to assess damage at Goma Airport and to assist with the safe disposal of unexploded ordnance across the city. The violence must come to an end, and M23's continued territorial expansion threats the sovereignty of the DRC and undermines the possibility of the dialogue. We cannot afford to stand and allow further losses, including the potential fall of Kisangani, This is why we firmly denounce any form of support extended to M23 or other armed groups operating in the DRC. It's time for this Council to genuinely support and facilitate the cessation of hostilities, including the withdrawal of M23 from territories under their control since the turn of the year. Second, A3 is deeply concerned that in the face of this violence, the humanitarian situation has significantly worsened, according to the figures from UN OCHA. More than 21 million people require humanitarian assistance across the DRC. The escalation of violence has worsened this crisis, particularly with the disruption of the supply routes. We therefore call for the development of securitization plan for Goma and surrounding areas and the reopening of Goma Airport, reoperationalization of the Kavumu Airport, and restoration of the key supply routes to ensure that timely delivery of humanitarian aid, as highlighted in the joint communique issued by the head of states and governments of EAC and SADC and endorsed by AU Peace and Security Communique. We therefore call for the restoration of essential utilities and supply lines for food and other essential commodities to ensure humanitarian support to those in need, and urge the parties to commit to upholding human rights law and international humanitarian law. Third, Mr. President, as this Council is aware, among the key roles of A3 is the responsibility to bring the gap between deliberations of this Council and African common position on the issue of relevance to the continent. As such, I would like to take this moment to highlight the efforts of African leadership in the broader search for a solution to the crisis of Eastern DRC, which has remained consistently high on the agenda of the African Union, the East African Community, and the Economic Community of Central Africa States and Southern Africa Development Communities. Over the last 3 years, in particular, since the re-emergence of M23, African leadership has responded urgently to the crisis, first by appointing His Excellency João Lourenço, the President of Angola, as the designated mediator between DRC and Rwanda and current chairperson of the African Union, as well as putting together an initial framework of the negotiation between Congolese government and the armed groups under the Nairobi process, led by the former President of Kenya, His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta. The involvement of SADC in the 2023 also signaled that an effective solution to the crisis in Congo would only be enabled by an active participation of broader regional actors, effectively showing that African conflicts need and deserve African-led and owned solutions. In this context, A3 would like to reiterate to all parties the importance of the commitment made within the framework of the Luanda process, and in this regard reiterates our call for the implementation of the concept of Operations Canopus, of the harmonization plan for the lifting of the Rwanda's defense measures and disengagement of the forces from the DRC and neutralization of the FDLR as agreed in the Luanda process. Furthermore, A3 would like to underscore the outcome of the recent meeting convened by African sub-regional and continental bodies at the head of states level, including the proposed merging of Nairobi and Luanda processes. It's our hope that the harmonization of these efforts will get the region closer to peace solutions. There is no gainsaying that the Council, as well as the international community at large, should strongly support these African initiatives. It's time for the Council to lend a real support to these African-led initiatives, act constructively to strengthen them, and to go beyond simply paying lip service. Mr. President, looking ahead, it's clear, as it has been reiterated many times in this Council, that there is no military solution to this conflict, which makes it all more urgent to secure unconditional and immediate ceasefire in eastern DRC. In this regard, we call to all parties to agree to a ceasefire and to commit to putting down their weapons and creating necessary space for a negotiated political solution. The A3 echoes the call for the East African Community and SADC meeting for monitoring such ceasefire by EAC and SADC Chiefs of Defense Forces. Along similar lines, we also look forward to the resumption of peace talks as called by the EAC and SADC and endorsed by the AU Peace and Security Head of States Gathering meeting. In this regard, we look forward to the implementation of the follow-up actions to be taken up by the joint meeting of EAC and SADC ministers to address all residual issues relating to the attainment of sustainable peace and security in the Eastern DRC. In conclusion, Mr. President, we have heard countless times, both within and outside the Council, the calls for lasting peace. The people of DRC need and deserve to live in their country peacefully. The territories of DRC should not be violated, and its sovereignty and territorial integrity should be respected. Now, this is the time to move beyond rhetoric and to act decisively in our deliberations to find solutions that both addresses the current crisis while ultimately addressing the root causes of this conflict. The A3 stands in solidarity with the children, women, men of the DRC and underscores the full respect of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I thank you.
我感谢索马里代表所做的发言。下面我请巴基斯坦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Pakistan delegation thanks you for convening this urgent meeting of the Security Council. We thank SRSG Bindu Keita and Special Envoy Wang Xia for their briefings on the disturbing situation in eastern DRC. We welcome the participation in this meeting of the Foreign Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo and other African permanent representatives. Mr. President, both our briefers have mentioned that history is repeating itself. And we must remember the adage that those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. In defiance of the Council's position expressed in its press statement of 6 February and the African mediation processes, the M23 has continued its advance. Since the Council's meeting on January 26, the M23, backed by external forces, has attacked and taken control of the city of Goma, the airports of Goma and Kavumu, and now Bukavu, the capital of Sud-Kivu. As the Secretary General of the United Nations has stated at the AU summit last weekend, the M23 offensive, and I quote, threatens to push the entire region over the precipice. Regional escalation must be avoided at all costs, unquote. Mr. President, we condemn in the strongest words the occupation of Goma and Bukavu by M23. It must immediately accept a ceasefire, stop its advance, and withdraw from the territories it has taken over, and do so without preconditions. We reiterate our support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Democratic Republic of Congo. we call for the withdrawal of all uninvited forces, including Rwandan forces, from the territory of the DRC. A wider war must be prevented at all costs. Mr. President, we are extremely concerned about the reported violence committed against civilians in areas under the control of M23, including extrajudicial killings. These must be immediately stopped, and those responsible must be held to account. Immediate and unhindered access must be provided to humanitarian organizations to alleviate the humanitarian crises, including the repair and opening of the airports in order to fly in medical and other essential supplies. We have received information on violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in Nord-Kivu, largely due to the presence of MONUSCO in Nord-Kivu. However, due to its untimely withdrawal from South-Kivu, we must be concerned that away from the eyes of an impartial entity, the violations of human rights in South-Kivu could be much worse than in Nord-Kivu. Mr. President, we are all agreed that there is no military solution to the crisis in eastern DRC. Pakistan respects the African regional processes to bring an end to the hostilities and to promote a resolution of this conflict. We welcome the AU communique and the EAC SADC joint communique calling for cessation of hostilities and an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. It is important that the understandings reached at the SADC-EAC summit be implemented urgently. Similarly, there is a need to carry forward the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and we note the move to merge these processes. The understandings reached under the Luanda process for the withdrawal of Rwanda Defense Forces and the neutralization of the FDLR must be both implemented. Mr. President, at the same time, it must be recognized that the Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. It is this Council which has the authority to enforce the decisions of the international community, including those reached within the African processes. Pakistan is therefore working constructively to evolve effective Council action that enjoys the widest possible support within the Council and responds to the threat posed by the M23 offensive and the danger of a wider conflict. Mr. President, Pakistan is particularly concerned about the challenges facing MONUSCO due to the volatile security environment in and around Goma. Its overcrowded facilities, limited rations, spreading disease, as well as the restrictions that have been imposed on the movement of MONUSCO by M23. The Security Council must be unequivocal in demanding that MONUSCO be assured of freedom of movement to carry out its operational activities and to perform its mandate to protect civilians, including outside its bases. The M23 and its supporters must be told categorically that attacks on United Nations and other peacekeepers and civilians constitute war crimes for which those responsible will be held accountable. At the same time, there is need to review the present and future role of MONUSCO. It is positive that the new force commander has joined MONUSCO. We call on all TCCs and PCCs within MONUSCO to respect the chain of command and to show their commitment and solidarity with the mission in these difficult times. Close consultations are also needed to develop options for MONUSCO's future role in the DRC under the evolving scenarios for the denouement of this conflict. Mr. President, finally, we urge that the Security Council seriously address the root cause of the conflict in eastern DRC, that is, the illegal exploitation of its natural resources. This requires greater oversight and traceability mechanisms working in coordination with the DRC government and regional and international partners. Pakistan, in this context, recognizes the important role of the Special Envoy, Mr. Huang Xia, in this endeavor. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢巴基斯坦代表的发言，下面我请希腊代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank SRSG Mrs. Keita, especially Envoy Mr. Huang Xia, for briefing us on this urgent meeting today and commend the courage of all of MONUSCO's personnel in these very difficult circumstances. I would also like to welcome the participation of the Honorable Foreign Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo in our meeting. Mr. President, allow me to emphasize briefly 4 key points. First, we strongly condemn the capture of the cities of Sake, Goma, and Bukavu by the M23. We reiterate that the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of the DRC must be fully respected. The presence of Rwandan troops of the territory of DRC and the support to the M23 are very concerning and are strongly condemned. We call on Rwanda to cease its support to the M23 and to immediately withdraw its forces. Second, we call for urgent de-escalation, and we stress that it is more imperative than ever that particularly Rwanda and DRC commit to the ceasefire as agreed last August, re-engage in the political dialogue, and implement all decisions and commitments agreed under the Luanda process. We encourage African-led initiatives and regional efforts, including by the African Union, the East African Community, and SADC, and we call DRC and Rwanda to return immediately to the table of negotiations. Third, we are deeply concerned about the grave humanitarian and security consequences of the M23 offensive, both in North and South Kivu. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and ensure unrestricted humanitarian access. We strongly condemn all forms of human rights violations, abuses, violence against civilians, summary executions and maiming, sex and gender-based violence, recruitment and use of children. Fourth and last, we reiterate our full support to MONUSCO, which is acting within its mandate and doing critical work in the DRC, stress our strong commitment to the safety and security of its peacekeepers, and condemn the attacks committed against personnel. MONUSCO must be granted full access and freedom of movement. Its personnel must be allowed to return to Goma in order to effectively fulfill its mandate, in particular the protection of civilians and address urgent needs. The protection of civilians and of humanitarian and medical personnel must remain an absolute priority. Attacks against peacekeepers may constitute potential war crimes, and those attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers form also a basis for potential sanctions designation. Mr. President, we stand ready to support any further engagement of this Council as necessary. I thank you.
希腊代表的发言，下面我请斯洛文尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I also want to thank the briefers, Bento Keita and Huang Xia, for briefing us. And we want to welcome Foreign Minister of Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we also want to welcome representatives of the region in the chamber. Given the rapidly evolving security situation and escalating humanitarian concerns, we believe this Council meeting is critically needed. In the Eastern DRC, the situation is swiftly and visibly deteriorating into mounting peril. Civilians are caught in the eye of a violent storm. In the words of Special Envoy, there is a risk of regional conflagration, and the risk is real. Regional peace and security is in danger. Following the seizure of Goma, reports showcase a shocking death toll and thousands with life-altering injuries. The violence must stop immediately. There is no justification for the horrific stories of summary executions, including children, for widespread conflict-related sexual violence, for widespread displacement, for child recruitment, for intimidation against human rights defenders and civil society actors. We categorically condemn any targeting, threats, or attacks on humanitarian workers and denounce these actions in the strongest possible terms. It remains imperative that those responsible are held accountable. Mr. President, the gravity of this crisis extends far beyond the immediate human tragedy. The rapid offensive by M23, supported by Rwandan Defense Forces, now marking its presence in Sud-Kivu, with the seizure of key locations such as Kavumu Airport and the city of Bukavu, poses a significant threat to the broader stability of the Great Lakes region. We demand that M23 withdraw unconditionally from all territories they have occupied. Immediate and unrestricted reopening of the airport in Goma must be ensured so that the delivery of humanitarian assistance, the rotation and resupply of UN peacekeepers and other personnel can proceed safely. Unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured without delay, with secure humanitarian corridors to reach those in need. All parties must adhere to international humanitarian and human rights law. We echo the African Union, SADC and EAC in urgently calling for an immediate halt to all hostilities and a return to diplomatic dialogue. We continue to support strong African engagement and regional diplomatic processes, notably through the merged Luanda-Nairobi process. We continue to call on DRC and Rwanda to exercise the utmost restraint, de-escalate tensions, re-engage in dialogue, address the root causes, and prioritize peace and stability for the region. We condemn any violation of the DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Unauthorized military presence in DRC is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. We call on Rwanda to fully withdraw its forces immediately and to end any support for M23. We call on DRC to stop cooperating with the FDLR and other armed groups. Finally, we condemn in the strongest terms attacks, hostility, and threats against MONUSCO and its personnel. We further denounce the severe restrictions imposed by M23 on MONUSCO and their freedom of movement, which have not only impeded the implementation of their mandated tasks, but have also contributed to a compromised situation at their bases. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, in conclusion, I reiterate what we stated already during the first emergency meeting. This Council must not remain passive in the face of this crisis. We have clearly heard calls from the field and received abundance of reports. Now we must step up. Thank you.
感谢斯洛文尼亚代表的发言。下面我请美国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, SRSG Bintou Keita and Special Envoy Huang Xie, for your briefings and for your leadership. The United States extends its fullest support to MONUSCO and all UN personnel supporting peaceful and humanitarian responses to the crisis in eastern DRC. Mr. President and Council members, how many times must we meet to discuss these predictable cycles of violence? For months, we have consistently watched M23 and Rwanda ignore ceasefires, seize territory under false pretexts, and deny intention of further expansion, only to start the cycle anew. We have witnessed M23 sow chaos and wage brutal violence against civilians on the streets of Masisi, Goma, and now Bukavu, all under the disingenuous guise of liberation or restoring order. The United States strongly condemns the seizure of Kavumu Airport and the city of Bukavu by M23 and Rwandan forces. We continue to stand in full support of the Congolese people and of their country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Once again, we urge M23 to immediately cease its offensive and withdraw from all territories of which it has taken control. We urge Rwanda to cease supporting M23, immediately withdraw its forces from the DRC, and hold accountable those who perpetrate human rights abuses and violations. We now have confirmed reports from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights of summary executions of children at the hands of M23 in Bukavu, among other serious human rights abuses. We condemn these abuses, for which there cannot be continued impunity. We watched with concern Monday's demonstrations at MONUSCO's bases in Goma, and we remain alarmed by reliable reports that M23, with Rwandan support, are orchestrating these protests, which have killed peacekeepers and civilians in the past. We condemn these and all actions that harm UN peacekeepers and undermine MONUSCO's civilian protection mandate, which is so instrumental at this moment in eastern DRC. M23 must immediately cease its hostile threats against MONUSCO, reopen the Goma airport, and ensure the UN's full freedom of movement, particularly at border crossings. In light of Rwanda's support for M23's hostility against MONUSCO, we reiterate that the UN should immediately engage the Rwandan government at the highest levels to underscore the importance of peacekeeper safety and security. Without a change in Rwanda's behavior, the UN should reevaluate Rwanda's ability to participate constructively in UN peacekeeping. We call for protection and free movement of civilians seeking safety, and for all parties to uphold international humanitarian principles, stop attacks on civilian infrastructure, and guarantee unhindered humanitarian access. M23's and Rwanda's actions have also created space for other armed groups to expand their own violent assaults on Congolese civilians. We condemn the latest horrific attacks carried out by Codeco, and we applaud MONUSCO's quick response to defend the population against further violence. This conflict has also exacerbated exploitation and trafficking in eastern DRC's mineral sector, with widespread evidence that 3T minerals are being smuggled to enter international supply chains, including through neighboring countries. We urge an immediate cessation of sourcing of minerals from areas controlled by M23, particularly those identified as red zones by the DRC government. It is beyond time for this Council, the UN, and the international community to marshal a strong and unambiguous response to M23 and Rwandan actions which undermine prospects for peace and bring the region closer to the brink of an all-out war. We fully support the call by the AU Peace and Security Council for an immediate resumption of negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, both military and non-military, including the M23, under the frameworks of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. Intense and sustained pressure is needed now to compel Rwanda to return to the negotiations under the Angola-led Luanda process and to work in good faith toward a diplomatic resolution to the conflict in eastern DRC. The United States is prepared to work with Council members on sanctions nominations in the 1533 Committee, and we urge Council members to take urgent action. Furthermore, we remain prepared to leverage all the tools at our disposal in order to hold accountable those responsible for sustaining armed conflict, instability, and insecurity in the DRC. I thank you.
感谢美国代表的发言。下面我请圭亚那代表发言。
Mr. President, Guyana welcomes the urgent convening of this meeting, given the recent developments in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, particularly in Bukavu. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Shea for their briefings. I welcome the participation of Her Excellency Ms. Therese Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie of the DRC, and also the permanent representatives of several other African countries in this meeting. Mr. President, Guyana aligns with the statement delivered on behalf of A3 and wishes to further elucidate in our national capacity. We are alarmed by the recent developments in eastern DRC, with the M23 expanding its territorial gains by more than 30% since 15 January, and with that, its violent attacks against innocent civilians. The reports emanating from the United Nations about increased human rights violations and abuse are extremely concerning and demand a swift response from the international community, including the Security Council. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed cases of summary execution of children by the M23 after they entered the city of Bukavu last week. The office has also documented cases of ill treatment, conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence, child and forced recruitment, intimidation, and death threats. Guyana condemns these violations by the M23, reportedly with the support of the Rwandan Defense Force, and calls for an immediate ceasefire and for the group to withdraw to the pre-cantonment areas. We also call on Rwanda to cease its support to the M23 and to withdraw its forces from the territory of the DRC immediately and unconditionally. We stress that it is unacceptable for foreign military forces of any country to enter the territory of another without authorization, and call for full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC. Moreover, we call on the government of the DRC to sever its ties with the FDLR and to implement its commitment to neutralize this group. Mr. President, as with any conflict situation, it is always the innocent civilians that bear the brunt. In this regard, we urge the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, allowing for unhindered access to essential services and delivery of humanitarian aid. We call on all parties to uphold and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, including by ensuring the protection of civilians and the delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. We also reject the severe restrictions being imposed upon MONUSCO's freedom of movement, preventing efforts to assess the damage at the Goma airport and to assist with the safe disposal of unexploded ordnance across the city. MONUSCO must be allowed to implement its mandate without restrictions. We further emphasize that attacks against peacekeepers may constitute a war crime and call for all hostilities against peacekeepers to cease. Guyana extends its full support to MONUSCO in the implementation of its mandate and insists on full accountability for any attack against MONUSCO personnel. Mr. President, the ongoing offensive in Nord-Kivu and Sud-Kivu poses a significant threat to peace and security of the Great Lakes region and risks a wider regional conflagration. We must ensure that this does not happen. For this reason, Guyana supports the initiative for this Council to speak with one voice and send a clear message to the parties. As we continue our deliberations on the draft resolution under consideration, we urge fellow Council members to focus on the bigger picture, to support the regional efforts, to not only address the current crisis, but more importantly, its root causes, and to find a lasting solution. We also encourage the international community to work together to de-escalate rather than fuel tensions. There is no military solution, as was said before, to this crisis, and now is certainly not the time for soundbite diplomacy. Any action that pulls states away from dialogue condemns their entire populations into cycles of conflict and violence, and it is always the innocent civilians that suffer. The path to a lasting solution will only be found through dialogue, diplomacy, and the rule of law. In this regard, Guyana fully supports the regional mediation efforts, including the Luanda and Nairobi processes, and welcomes the ongoing efforts of the African Union, the East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community in responding to the crisis. We also welcome the communiqué adopted by the AU Peace and Security Council following their summit meeting of 14 February, which endorsed the decisions of the EAC, SADC, and joint EAC-SADC meetings, and encouraged the international community to support their implementation. More importantly, we urge Rwanda and the DRC to return to dialogue and diplomacy, to fully implement their commitments under the regional processes, and to engage in good faith with each other to reach a peaceful and sustainable solution. In conclusion, Mr. President, Guyana reaffirms its support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC and for all efforts that will bring peace to the region. I thank you.
我感谢圭亚那代表的发言。下面我请巴拿马代表发言。
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos el informe de la representante especial del secretario general y jefa de la MONUSCO, Bintou Keita, así como del enviado especial del secretario general para la región de los Grandes Lagos de África, Juan Chia, cuyo liderazgo es fundamental en estos momentos críticos para la estabilidad de la República Democrática del Congo y de toda la región. Reconocemos la participación de la distinguida ministra de Relaciones Exteriores de la República Democrática de Congo, así como de los representantes de los países de la región que nos distinguen con su participación. La República de Panamá expresa su profunda preocupación ante la alarmante escalada de violencia en el este de la República Democrática del Congo. En las últimas semanas, el grupo rebelde M23 ha intensificado sus operaciones militares, logrando con violencia el control de ciudades estratégicas como Goma, su aeropuerto y más recientemente Bukavu. Estas acciones han provocado la pérdida de miles de vidas y el desplazamiento forzado de cientos de miles de personas, agravando aún más una crisis humanitaria de por sí devastadora. Nos alarma además el recrudecimiento de las tensiones entre la República Democrática de Congo y Ruanda, cuya relación se encuentra en un punto crítico tras el reciente intercambio de acusaciones sobre incursiones transfronterizas y el apoyo a grupos armados. En este sentido, instamos a todos los estados de la región a ejercer la máxima contención y a reafirmar su compromiso con los mecanismos diplomáticos existentes, en particular con el proceso de Luanda y el proceso de Nairobi, cuyo cumplimiento efectivo es esencial para la reducción de tensiones y el establecimiento de una paz duradera. Señor presidente, la violencia desatada por actores armados no solo impacta a la población civil, sino que también representa un grave desafío para la MONUSCO, que enfrenta crecientes amenazas y restricciones a sus operaciones. Asimismo, reiteramos nuestro rechazo a cualquier forma de violencia que atente contra la seguridad e integridad física de la población civil y hacemos un llamado urgente a reforzar la protección de los cascos azules. De igual manera, respaldamos el llamado de las entidades de las Naciones Unidas para la implementación de pausas humanitarias temporales en zonas críticas, así como para el establecimiento de corredores humanitarios seguros y eficaces que garanticen el acceso a la asistencia vital. Por otro lado, Panamá condena enérgicamente las graves violaciones de derechos humanos, incluidas la violencia sexual como arma de guerra y el reclutamiento forzado de niños y niñas por parte de grupos armados. Estas atrocidades no pueden quedar impunes. Exhortamos al Consejo de Seguridad a fortalecer el régimen de sanciones contra quienes perpetúan la violencia y a garantizar que los responsables rindan cuentas ante la justicia internacional. Para finalizar, reafirmamos nuestra firme e inquebrantable compromiso con la soberanía e integridad territorial de la República Democrática del Congo. Exhortamos en particular al M23, a cesar sus avances y a retirarse por completo y de inmediato en estricto cumplimiento del alto al fuego y el respeto absoluto a los procesos de mediación en curso. A la vez, por las mismas razones, exhortamos a Ruanda a detener su apoyo al M23, a ejercer sus mejores oficios para desescalar este conflicto y a retirar sus fuerzas armadas del territorio de la República Democrática del Congo a la mayor brevedad posible. Gracias, señor presidente.
我感谢巴拿马代表的发言，我现在请丹麦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank SRSG Keita for informing us of the current situation on the ground, and Special Envoy Shia for his briefing on regional peace efforts. I welcome the presence of Her Excellency Foreign Minister Wagner at this meeting, as well as all the representatives from the region. Mr. President, Denmark strongly condemns the ongoing offensive by the M23, backed by the RDF, as well as the recent capture of Kavumu airport and the city of Bukavu. The offensive has resulted in immense suffering and risks plunging the region into an even deeper and wider conflict. There can be no military solution, only a political one. What is urgently needed is the resumption of dialogue with all state and non-state actors, including the M23, within the framework of the Luanda and Nairobi processes, respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law, and the full respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the DRC. We call on Rwanda to immediately withdraw its forces from DRC territory and to cease its support to the M23. The M23 must immediately halt and reverse its ongoing offensive and withdraw from the territories it has taken control of. We call on the DRC to cease its support to the FDLR. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 points. First, what we are witnessing in North and South Kivu is nothing short of a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are urgently seeking protection from violence, persecution, rape, disease, and death. Humanitarians have been attacked and killed, humanitarian warehouses and facilities have been looted, access and supply routes have been obstructed, and civilian infrastructure has been attacked. This leaves civilians, including women and children, at even greater risk. This is unacceptable. Denmark demands the full, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian and medical staff, and demands that all parties immediately uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law. Second, we are appalled by the reports of ongoing serious human rights violations and abuses taking place in North and South Kivu, including summary executions and sexual and gender-based violence. We condemn any attacks and threats against journalists, human rights defenders, and members of civil society organizations. Those responsible must be held to account. We welcome the recent decision by the Human Rights Council to support such efforts. Third, we reiterate our unwavering support to MONUSCO as it continues its mandated task in a highly complex environment. The actions of the M23 and RDF are not only putting peacekeepers at risk, but also obstructing the implementation of the mission's mandate. The safety and security of UN and humanitarian personnel, including those sheltering in MONUSCO bases, must be ensured. This also goes for freedom of movement of MONUSCO. We reiterate that targeted attacks against MONUSCO peacekeepers constitute a breach of international law, may constitute a war crime, and may serve as a ground for the imposition of UN sanctions. Mr. President, let me conclude by commending the African-led efforts to reach a solution to the crisis in the eastern DRC. Spearheaded by Angolan President Lourenço, we last year saw a glimpse of hope in the Luanda process. That momentum must be maintained. We reaffirm our unwavering support for any future joint peace process owned by and for the region, including by the East African Community, the South African Development Community, and the African Union. As a matter of international peace and security, however, the Security Council has responsibility to take action for the peaceful resolution of the conflict in eastern DRC. It is our duty to urgently consider how to utilize the available means to halt and reverse this escalation, ensure humanitarian access, and safeguard stability in the region. Denmark stands ready to work with all members to this end. I thank you.
感谢 丹麦代表的发言，下面我请俄罗斯代表发言。
Господин председатель, благодарим спецпредставителя генерального секретаря Бинту Кейту и спецпосланника Хуанся за брифинги. Приветствуем участие в заседании министра иностранных дел Демократической Республики Конго Терезы Вагнер, а также представители Руанды, Анголы, Бурунди, Кении, ЮАР и Зимбабве. Хотели бы начать свое выступление с выражения соболезнований семьям граждан ДРК, которые погибли и продолжают гибнуть в результате эскалации со стороны М-23 в последние месяцы. Россия выражает свою солидарность с правительством и народом ДРК в этот сложный период. Мы настаиваем на необходимости безоговорочного уважения суверенитета, территориальной целостности, независимости и единства этой страны в соответствии с Уставом ООН. Мы также вновь выражаем соболезнования семьям погибших миротворцев ООН и павших бойцов сообщества развития Юга Африки. Солидарность с правительствами ДРК и государств, потерявших своих военнослужащих. Нападения на миротворцев неприемлемы ни при каких обстоятельствах. Россия решительно осуждает действия группировки М-23. Призываем к немедленной остановке боестолкновений и выводу бойцов этого незаконного вооруженного формирования из захваченных населенных пунктов, из занятых территорий ДРК. Мы также призываем Руанду отреагировать на соответствующие требования членов Совета Безопасности, а также Афросоюза о снятии своих оборонительных мер и отозвать свои воинские подразделения. Эскалацию на востоке ДРК необходимо остановить. Однако военного пути урегулирования кризиса не существует. Это возможно только в результате политической договоренности ДРК и Руанды, которые должны вернуться за стол переговоров, подтвердить приверженность взаимным обязательствам в рамках луандийского процесса и договориться, как стабилизировать ситуацию. Данный конфликт имеет давнюю и очень кровопролитную историю, и его коренные причины должны быть устранены. Устойчивого урегулирования удастся добиться только после прекращения государственного взаимодействия с незаконными вооруженными формированиями, в их числе и демократические силы освобождения Руанды. Отдельно хотели бы акцентировать, что без урегулирования статуса М-23 в рамках межконгоресского диалога жизнеспособную политическую формулу прекращения конфликта не найти. Параметры этих процессов должны быть определены совместно Киншасой и Кигали. В противном случае все происходящее сейчас рискует перерасти в межгосударственный конфликт регионального масштаба. Мы уже видим все больше предпосылок к этому. Господин председатель, Россия приветствует усилия региональных государств и африканских лидеров по содействию стабилизации на востоке ДРК. Мы отмечаем важное решение по итогам саммитов Евросоюза, САДК, ИВАС, ЭСКЗА. Надеемся, что стороны услышат голоса своих соседей по континенту, а заявленные меры будут приняты и принесут свои результаты. Главным из них должно стать прекращение страданий гражданского населения. Мы глубоко озабочены гуманитарными последствиями эскалации на востоке ДРК. С тревогой следим за поступающими сообщениями о росте случаев внесудебных расправ, нарушений прав человека, сексуального насилия, вербовки детей в ряды НВФ. Все это должно прекратиться. Господин председатель, отдельно хотели бы высказать свою позицию по поводу всем известной, но умышленно обделенной вниманием темы деятельности в ДРК частных военных компаний из Европы. Мы все видели, что они сдали оружие миротворцам ООН с ДРК. Кадры последующей транспортировки европейских наемников в Кигали облетели весь мир. Полагаем, что эти события не совсем совпадают с тем, как Россия видит мандат миссии, выданный ей Советом Безопасности. Убеждены также, что молчаливая реакция наших европейских и американских коллег на столь неоднозначные факты противоречит их декларируемой приверженности к осуждению африканского двустороннего сотрудничества в области безопасности с другими государствами. Это особенно удивительно на фоне многолетнего нагнетания дезинформационной кампании в отношении России из-за укрепления взаимодействия с африканскими государствами в сфере безопасности. Это неоколониальные и двойные стандарты во всей их неприглядности. Это, к слову, также одна из причин продолжения конфликта в Африке. В завершение хотели бы заверить, что Россия продолжит содействовать усилиям по купированию эскалации и восстановлению перспективы дипломатического регулирования. Конголезцам нужны мир, безопасность и уверенность в завтрашнем дне. Именно этим мы руководствуемся в своей работе на площадке этого совета. Благодарю вас.
感谢俄罗斯代表的发言。下面我请英国代表发言。
Thank you, President. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Xia for their briefings today. And I welcome the participation of DRC Foreign Minister Wagner in this meeting, as well as the representatives from other countries of the region. President, I'll make 3 points. First, we express our deep concern at the continued advance into DRC of the M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces. This is an unacceptable violation of DRC's sovereignty and territorial integrity and a breach of the UN Charter. The occupation of Bukavu is a serious escalation which heightens the risk of a wider regional conflict. The United Kingdom is clear that there needs to be an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to dialogue via African-led peace processes. There can be no military solution. As my Foreign Secretary has said, Rwanda must withdraw its troops. The UK is actively considering next steps alongside international partners, including the possibility of a review of all UK support to Rwanda. Second, urgent action is needed to halt the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation. The M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces takeover of Goma has displaced close to 1 million people in North and South Kivu. Hundreds of thousands are now in desperate need of life-saving support. Civilians, particularly women and girls, are at increased risk of violence, including sexual violence. We have seen harrowing reports, including of 165 women raped and many burned alive at Goma Muzenze prison earlier this month. The parties to the conflict must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. And humanitarian access, especially via Goma Airport, should urgently be restored. Third, MONUSCO's freedom of movement is essential to support the protection of civilians and facilitate aid delivery. Restrictions by the M23 and Rwandan Defence Forces are unacceptable. The parties must respect MONUSCO's mandate as authorised by this Council. The UK strongly condemns all attacks on UN peacekeepers and recalls that attacks on MONUSCO could be grounds for UN sanctions. President, to conclude, the UK welcomes regional efforts to secure a lasting solution to this conflict. We welcome the contribution of the recent joint EAC and SADC summit and the AU-PSC summit. We urge DRC and Rwanda to engage in good faith in existing peace processes. We need to see the rapid implementation of the actions agreed at the summits, supported by urgent action by this Council. I thank you.
感谢英国代表的发言。下面我请韩国代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important meeting. I thank SRSG Keita and Special Envoy Xia for their briefings. I also welcome Foreign Minister Kaikwamba Wagner of DRC to this meeting. The situation in Eastern DRC is urgent. There is almost no single day that passes without a further advancement by the M23. When this Council met for 2 emergency meetings 3 weeks ago, Goma fell for the 5th time in history. Over the last weekend, the M23 took control over Bukavu in South Kivu for the first time ever, escalating this conflict to a completely new sphere by controlling all of Lake Kivu's access points and the DRC-Rwanda border crossings. M23's illegitimate parallel administrations if sustained for longer, may also create consequences too deep-rooted to reverse. Moreover, the impact on civilians is devastating, causing hundreds of thousands to displace and regressing human rights, particularly in extrajudicial killings, conflict-related sexual violence, and the summary execution of children. The entire DRC is now at stake, and the situation is literally at the brink of full-scale regional war. In light of this perilous situation, let me emphasize 3 points. First, the Republic of Korea strongly condemns and demands an M23 to immediately cease hostilities and withdraw from all occupying areas in North and South Kivu. We also urge Rwanda to refrain from escalating the conflict through its support and participation. We should all be reminded of the fundamental principle of the UN Charter, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Likewise, the DRC should also stop its support to specific armed groups and neutralize the FDLR. Exploiting hate speech and misinformation campaigns to fuel conflict must also end. All parties to conflict should also ensure MONUSCO's freedom of movement. Any attempt to hinder the implementation of its mandate, particularly through GPS jamming and spoofing, must stop. Attacks on peacekeepers may constitute war crimes, and their safety and security must be prioritized. We cannot lose any more peacekeepers. Second, we urge the DRC and Rwanda to urgently return to meaningful diplomatic dialogue for an unconditional ceasefire. Korea commends and supports the recent joint efforts of the EAC, SADC, AU, and particularly President Lourenço of Angola to find a political solution to this conflict. Now, more than ever, we need Africa's collective wisdom and concerted action for an African solution. We hope that meaningful progress can be achieved by building on the outcomes of the recent EAC-SADC joint statement and the AU-PSC meeting. These efforts should further advance the gains made through the Luanda and the Nairobi processes, paving the way for lasting peace in Eastern DRC. Third, we strongly emphasize the importance of unhindered humanitarian access and the opening of humanitarian corridors in North and South Kivu. Goma and the Kavumu airports should be able to operate without restrictions to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid. Key border crossings also need to be open to allow voluntary and safe movement of civilians and people in need. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its steadfast support for MONUSCO, the Office of Special Envoy of the Great Lakes region, and the regional and sub-regional organizations for their efforts in addressing this tragic crisis. The Charter of the UN entrusted this Council to take primary responsibility for the maintenance of the international peace and security. It is time we put our best efforts to fulfill this mandate on this complex conflict. We sincerely hope that the Council will soon be able to pronounce itself with a decisive and unequivocal message for lasting peace in Eastern DRC. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢韩国代表的发言。我现在以中国代表的身份发言。各位同事，首先我感谢凯塔特别代表和夏黄特使所做的通报，欢迎刚果金外长卡伊宽巴女士出席今天的会议。近日，继攻占格马后，323运动再次发起攻势，攻入刚东第二大城市布卡武。刚东局势急剧演变，牵动国际社会的神经。古特雷斯秘书长日前警告，323运动的持续攻势正在将整个地区 推向悬崖。刚才各位同事所谈，都进一步凸显了刚东局势的严峻性和危险性。3.23运动的进攻严重违反东共体和南共体联合峰会关于要求各方立即停火的决定，完全违背了其自身单方面停火的承诺，使局势进一步升级。中方强烈谴责3.23运动的军事行动，重申刚果金主权、领土完整应得到尊重，联合国宪章和国际法应得到遵守。我愿强调以下几点：第一，国际社会应敦促3.23运动立即无条件停止攻势，立即撤出占领区。中方重申，希望卢旺达能重视国际社会的呼吁，停止对3.23运动的军事支持，从刚果金领土立即撤出其所有军事力量。第二，国际社会要全力防止刚东冲突演变成更大规模的地区冲突。20多年前的刚果战争造成上百万人死亡，类似的悲剧不能重演。中方呼吁有关地区国家保持冷静克制，避免采取可能加剧紧张局势、激化各方矛盾的行动。第三，国际社会要敦促冲突各方遵守国际人道法，保护平民、人道工作者的安全，紧急开辟更多的人道救援通道，重新开放格马、布卡武机场，全面恢复水电等基本生活服务。联刚团根据安理会授权履行保护平民任务，各方不得干扰和阻碍。外国使团、侨民和企业的安全也必须得到充分保障。第四，国际社会应继续支持非盟次区域组织斡旋努力。中方欢迎非盟和和安会峰会致力于推动刚东问题的政治解决，期待东共体和南共体联合峰会成果得到尽快落实。各方要呼吁刚果金和卢旺达尽快重回外交轨道，在合并后的罗安达和内罗毕进程框架下解决彼此安全关切，包括消除解放卢旺达民主力量的威胁。第五，主要攸关方应充分发挥自身影响力，对当事国积极施加影响，推动局势降温。中方支持安理会积极履行维护国际和平的责任，采取负责任行动，同地区斡旋努力形成合力。中方将继续呼吁各方停火止战，恢复对话，为推动局势缓和做出不懈努力。谢谢。我现在继续行使安理会主席的职能。我现在请刚果民主共和国国务部长兼外交国际合作和法语国家事务部长卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下发言。
Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, je vous remercie pour la convocation de cette troisième réunion d'urgence sur la situation qui prévaut à l'est de la République démocratique du Congo. Je remercie la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général, Madame Bintou Keïta, ainsi que l'envoyé spécial du secrétaire général pour la région des Grands Lacs, Monsieur Xia Huang, pour leurs exposés respectifs. Je salue également la présence des représentants permanents des différents pays de la région des Grands Lacs ici présents. le Rwanda prépare un carnage à ciel ouvert avec une brutalité qui rappelle les heures les plus sombres de notre histoire. Le 26 janvier, j'avais prévenu. Aujourd'hui, ces mots sont réalité. En 48 heures seulement, plus de 4000 morts à Goma, des hommes et des femmes abattus, des enfants témoins d'exécutions sommaires, tués sans distinction ou exécutés avec une précision glaçante, comme le chef coutumier de Kiziba, abattu avec son épouse et ses 3 enfants le 11 février, comme l'artiste Delka Idengo, assassiné le 13 février pour imposer le silence. Et ce que nous n'avons pas, ce que nous ne savons, n'est qu'une infime partie de l'horreur qui nous parvient. Mais l'horreur ne s'arrête pas aux exécutions. À Goma, la vie est suspendue, prise en otage par la guerre. Plus de 4500 blessés ont afflué vers des hôpitaux débordés. 500 corps ont été retrouvés calcinés dans la prison de Munzenze après des exécutions en masse. Chaque jour, la Croix-Rouge et le CICR ramassent des cadavres dans les rues, tandis que les morgues dépassent leurs capacités. Dans des camps de fortune, les cas de Mpox, choléra et rougeole se repropagent, menaçant des milliers de déplacés sans accès à l'eau potable. Ceux qui survivent risquent de mourir autrement, sans aide, sans soins, sans évacuation. Les humanitaires sont pris pour cible, l'accès aux sinistrés bloqué. Voilà ce qui se passe quand un groupe terroriste prend le contrôle d'une ville et impose son administration criminelle sous le regard de ce Conseil. Ce Conseil qui observe, ce Conseil qui condamne, mais ce Conseil qui n'agit pas. Et maintenant, Bukavu. Même scénario. Pillage, hôpitaux détruits, routes coupées. Une guerre qui tue aussi par la faim et la privation des soins. Mais là encore, ce n'est pas suffisant pour ceux qui mènent cette campagne de terreur. À la privation s'ajoute l'exécution. À l'effondrement humanitaire s'ajoute la barbarie. Hier, le 18 février, le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme a rapporté que des exécutions d'enfants auraient été perpétrées par la coalition RDF M23. Oui, des enfants, abattus comme des cibles. Que reste-t-il de l'humanité lorsque même les plus jeunes, les plus innocents sont exécutés? Monsieur le Président, nous avons entendu cette formule devenue un refrain commode des solutions africaines pour des problèmes africains, mais qui ose encore s'en servir aujourd'hui comme prétexte à l'inaction. La communauté de développement de l'Afrique australe, SADC, et la communauté économique des États d'Afrique centrale, CEAC, ont unanimement condamné la présence rwandaise sur notre sol. Ce fait n'est plus contesté. 2 sous-régions, la SADC et l'EAC, ont tenu des réunions conjointes pour adopter des mesures urgentes, y compris un cessez-le-feu. Quant à l'Union africaine, son Conseil de paix et de sécurité, réuni au niveau des chefs d'État le 14 février, a appelé au retrait immédiat de toutes les forces étrangères non invitées de la RDC. En d'autres termes, le Rwanda. Le Rwanda et le M23 ont répondu et continuent de répondre par la violence, par la terreur. Face à l'aggravation rapide de la situation, de nombreux acteurs ont réagi en faisant ce qu'ils savent faire de mieux. Documenter les violations des droits de l'homme, ouvrir la voie à des poursuites pénales, poser des actes forts, mais essentiellement réactifs. Nous saluons la récente décision du Conseil des droits de l'homme de l'ONU d'ouvrir une enquête sur les exactions dans l'Est de la RDC, ainsi que l'appel de la CPI à recueillir des éléments de preuve sur ces crimes pour traduire les responsables en justice. Nous appuyons également la résolution du Parlement européen demandant la suspension de l'accord sur les matières premières entre l'Union européenne et le Rwanda, signé en février 2024, alors que Kigali armait le M23. Mais ce Conseil, toujours inactif, est le seul capable d'empêcher de nouveaux massacres et l'expansion de l'occupation. Il lui revient d'adopter des mesures robustes qui non seulement arrêtent les violences perpétrées par les troupes rwandaises et leurs supplétifs du M23, mais aussi mettent un coup d'arrêt au soutien d'un État membre de l'ONU à un groupe terroriste cherchant à renverser un gouvernement légitime et démocratiquement élu. Ce conflit ne se limite pas aux violences militaires, au pillage de nos ressources ou au dépeuplement de nos territoires. C'est un projet politique porté par le Rwanda à travers le M23 et l'AFC visant à renverser notre régime par la force. Mais la République démocratique du Congo a fait le choix de la démocratie. Une démocratie en construction, certes, mais la nôtre. Nous avons choisi la liberté sous un régime civil et non la soumission aux armes. Nul ne peut nous arracher ce choix, surtout pas un régime qui, depuis 3 décennies, s'efface derrière un homme qui confond l'État avec son pouvoir personnel. Ce contraste est saisissant. D'un côté, un peuple qui bâtit son avenir sur la volonté populaire, de l'autre, un régime qui ne survit que par la force, l'intimidation et la répression. Aujourd'hui, ce modèle de gouvernance par la peur tente de s'imposer chez nous. Ce n'est pas seulement une guerre pour un territoire, mais une guerre contre notre choix souverain d'un avenir différent. Le M23 et ses soutiens rwandais cherchent à imposer par les armes ce que les urnes ont rejeté. Mais le peuple congolais dit non. Un peuple dont l'âge moyen est de moins de 25 ans, un peuple marqué par la guerre et les promesses ajournées, mais qui refuse la loi des armes. Il veut choisir ses dirigeants dans les urnes et non sous la menace des canons. Il refuse d'être la génération sacrifiée d'une violence imposée de l'extérieur. Mr. President, this Council must act. It can no longer remain a silent witness to an unfolding tragedy, nor hide behind declarations of intent. The time for theoretical debates is over. It is now time to uphold the very principles that define this institution: peace, security, and respect for international law. International law that is universal and applies to all, even while seeking African solutions. Standing by silently while civilians are killed is not a solution, and certainly not an African one. We reiterate the urgency of these measures and demand immediate action. First, the Security Council must order an end to Rwanda's hostilities and demand the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from Congolese territory. These forces have trampled on international law, brought death and devastation, and violated our sovereignty. Their withdrawal is not negotiable, it is an imperative. Second, the Security Council must impose targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans, on the command structure of the Rwandan Defense Forces and the political decision-makers responsible for this aggression, including those who feign ignorance of their own troops' whereabouts. Thousands of Rwandan soldiers are leading M23 operations in our country, while their president, in a calculated display of plausible deniability, says, "I don't know." But you, members of the Council, know. We all know. The survivors who had to bury 4,000 bodies in Goma know. And in Goma, those graves bear witness. Third, the Security Council must impose a total ban on the export of all minerals from Rwanda, particularly coltan and gold, in order to end the looting of our resources. The DRC has taken its own measures by designating several mining sites as red zones, including Rubaya, from where Rwanda fraudulently exports over 150 tons of coltan each month. But national measures alone are not enough. As long as Rwanda is allowed to launder our resources with impunity, this war will continue. Fourth, the Security Council must immediately revoke Rwanda's status as a troop-contributing country to United Nations peacekeeping missions. A country that besieges MONUSCO bases, targets its aircrafts, and launches deadly attacks on UN peacekeepers, then goes further, using the repatriation of fallen peacekeepers as a political bargaining chip, has defied the very principles of peacekeeping. This contradiction erodes the credibility of the United Nations. Rwanda's status must be revoked without delay. Fifth, the Security Council must impose a strict notification and monitoring mechanism for any sale or transfer of arms to Rwanda. Every shipment of weapon destined for Kigali must be declared. traced, and closely monitored. It is unacceptable that arms continue to reach groups responsible for massacres and regional destabilization and under United Nations sanctions. Monsieur le Président, 3 réunions en moins d'1 mois. Aujourd'hui, vous avez tous condamné le Rwanda dans vos discours. Je m'excuse. Tous, sauf les A3, à savoir l'Algérie, la Somalie et la Sierra Leone. Mais il n'y a toujours pas de résolution. Le temps des compromis interminables est révolu. Il est temps d'agir. La République démocratique du Congo exige un vote public dans les plus brefs délais sur une résolution qui dénonce clairement l'occupation du Rwanda et qui exige le retrait de ses troupes, une résolution qui défend la Charte des Nations Unies. Assez de prétextes, assez de relativisme culturel derrière lequel se cache un attentisme aux conséquences tragiques. Que chacun assume sa position au grand jour. Monsieur le Président, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, il est temps de voter. Je vous remercie.
我感谢卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下的发言。下面我请卢旺达代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Allow me first to congratulate you on your presidency and leadership of this council. I also thank Ambassador Huang Xia and SRC Bintu Keita for their briefings. I also recognize the participation of Honorable Teresa Kaikamba Wagner, Minister of Foreign Affairs of DRC, and the representatives of Kenya, Angola, Burundi, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Mr. President, Rwanda commends the regional efforts led by the East African Community and the Southern African Development Corporation, SADC, particularly the joint summit held in Dar es Salaam on 8 February 2025. The joint summit meeting resulted in positive outcomes, including 1, a call for a ceasefire, 2, urgent humanitarian support, and 3, the merger of the Luanda and Nairobi peace processes to be led by a panel of facilitators from different regions under President Lorenzo. The joint EAC-SADC summit also directed resumption of direct negotiations and dialogue with all state and non-state parties, military and non-military, including the M23. These outcomes were endorsed by an extraordinary AU Peace and Security Council meeting at the head of state level, held on 14 February 2025, as well as the AU Assembly of Heads of State, held on 15th to 16th February 2025. Mr. President, Rwanda appreciates the support of those in this council who value Africa-led solutions. We remain fully engaged in these efforts and continue to support them with good faith and full commitment. However, we must condemn the actions of those, including a DRC, who undermine these efforts by lobbying Western capitals instead of engaging with African leadership and regional mechanisms. Despite the critical nature of the recent regional discussions, the DRC has consistently opted for virtual presence or outright disengagement in these key meetings. While regional leaders gathered at the AU summit to address the Eastern DRC security situation, the president of DRC, President Tshisekedi, was instead seen at the Munich Security Conference, continuing to call for sanctions and lobbying for sanctions against Rwanda rather than engaging in direct dialogues. Other heads of state were sitting in Addis trying to find solutions to these problems. So the biggest beneficiary of these discussions could have been benefited by being in that room. I cannot emphasize this enough. African leadership must drive the resolution of this conflict. Failure to support regional solutions has exacerbated instability in the past. This is why Rwanda calls for the full endorsement of the AU-backed EAC-SADC joint summit outcomes. Furthermore, at the heart of this crisis is a dangerous alliance between the DRC government and external actors, mainly the FDR genocidal militia, who have fueled ethnic rhetoric and enabled extremism to thrive for decades, but also the Burundian forces, the Sami DRC, as well as European mercenaries. Council members, instead of committing to inclusive dialogue, the DRC has consistently undermined regional mechanisms, pitted regional blocs against each other, disregarded ceasefires, refused dialogue with its own people, and escalated ethnic-based violence. Mr. President, Council members, since the fall of Goma, regional leaders have worked tirelessly to broker peace. Yet, the DRC government has responded by reinforcing its front lines with more troops and Burundian forces. This reckless militarization, coupled with state-sponsored incitement to violence, has created a lawless environment. The uncontrolled distribution of weapons has even led former DRC government-aligned militia to turn against Kinshasa. This we have always said. When a state actor proliferates and distributes weapons to negative armed groups, like the different Wazalendo groups, what you reap is chaos. And what we've seen in terms of the magnitude of loss of life caused by Wazalendo and all these young people who have been given thousands of weapons and mobilized and turned against each other, that's what we reap. Inflammatory statements from DRC officials, such as those made by the Honorable Minister in the previous Council meeting on the 29th January 2025, calling for, and I quote, the streets to take over, have worsened the situation. Indeed, soon after the Honorable Minister's foretelling in this Council, we observed cases of youth mobilization in 2 armed militia in South Kivu, led by known FARDC officers. Arming young civilians in an already unstable context is not only reckless, but an outright incitement to hatred and violence. And there is a lot of misinformation here. When FARDC forces were proliferating arms and including arming children, nobody talked about this, nobody spoke. And now you see misinformation about execution of children. I repeat, the proliferation of arms by a state actor to negative armed groups, and there are over 250 armed groups documented in DRC. That is a recipe for disaster. And that's the disaster that we continue to see. Arms should be proliferated to designated trained officers and military officers. The situation has deteriorated to the point where we see a lot of humanitarian challenges. Rwanda cannot take the blame for the problems that DRC has faced endemically. As President Kagame stated in Addis Ababa, and I quote, "We have our own problems to deal with. Congo is too big for Rwanda to carry on its back," end of quote. Rwanda has no interest in DRC's internal struggles. Allegations of land grabbing in courts or corrupt or occupation ignore fundamental power imbalances at play in the DRC. Our sole priority has always been and will always remain the security of our borders and the stability of our nation. We have stated over and over again the existential security threat that Rwanda faces from DRC. And this we take very seriously. Council members, Rwanda continues to welcome refugees fleeing the violence in the DRC, despite persistent calls from the DRC and its allies to impose sanctions on Rwanda. Ironically, among those crossing into Rwanda are the same security threats we have repeatedly warned this esteemed council about. On the 29th January, over 280 foreign mercenaries, along with over 100 Congolese soldiers, crossed into Rwanda territory, exposing the FARDC's long-standing use of foreign fighters with no reaction whatsoever from the international community. Yet, as we have repeatedly said, the use of mercenaries by state actors contravenes the 1989 United Nations Convention and the 1977 OAU Convention, which prohibits and illegalizes the use of mercenaries by states. More concerning is the international community's reluctance to address the existential threat Rwanda faces, the ethnic cleansing of Congolese Tutsi, and the misinterpretation of the conflict. Instead of acknowledging the DRC's responsibility, blame has been conveniently shifted, first to Rwanda, and now even to former President Joseph Kabila. When will this blame game end? I think someone here has to take responsibility. Reality has always been clear. The M23's resurgence is rooted in decades-long persecution of Congolese communities based on ethnicity, predating Rwanda's current government. Rwanda has consistently warned that the FDR is central to this crisis. Since 2018, over 20 incursions have been launched into Rwanda, particularly in the southern province and in the northwestern region. Despite claims that the FDR is a weakened force, its active collaboration with and financing by RDC proves otherwise. The DRC government must recognize that its coalition with the FDR destabilizes Rwanda and perpetuates suffering among Congolese civilians. Ignoring the FDR's role is a failure to hold accountable those responsible for exporting extremist ideology beyond Rwanda's borders. But beyond the FDR council members, Rwanda is also concerned by a myriad of foreign forces deployed along its borders, namely the Burundian forces that share the same ethnic ideology as the FDR, SAMI DRC, and the remaining mercenaries. We are also concerned by the president of DRC's push for more foreign troops he is currently requesting from other African countries. All those foreign forces need to withdraw from Eastern DRC as they constitute a direct threat to Rwanda's security. In fact, when Goma fell, FARDC, Burundian forces, and FDLR forces turned their weapons on Rwanda, killing 16 innocent civilians and wounding 177 civilians, and destroying their properties and livelihoods. Yet no country condemned this blatant violation of Rwanda's sovereignty. Rwanda has no choice but to strengthen its defense and will continue to do so. Mr. President, on the question of MONUSCO, we have been very, very clear, and Rwanda's position remains peacekeepers have to be safe, peacekeepers have to be protected, and that is a canon that we respect, and we have said it over and over again. However, transparency is also very important. Information to the Council that is accurate is critical. There is critical information that we believe SRSG Bintou Keita should have shared with the Council on MONUSCO's collaboration with M23, and specifically the outcome of a meeting that was held yesterday between DSRSG, Vivian Van der Per, and the leader of AFC/M23, Colonel Nanga. We believe that that information would have been critical to share so that at least the Council knows. Mr. President, regarding mineral exploitation, the responsible parties are well known who exploit DRC. Rwanda holds no mining concession in the DRC, yet we continue to be falsely accused. The claim that mineral resources fuel this conflict is false and inciting. The M23 issue is about people fighting for their rights and survival, fighting for their inherent citizenship rights and access to their own ancestral property. Rwanda cannot be scapegoated for the DRC's economic dysfunction. It is Congolese officials who benefit most from instability and the corrupt mining sector, whereas Rwanda has always promoted responsible sourcing and formalized trade to curb smuggling and illicit activities in mining. Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains committed to regional mechanisms to neutralize the FDLR and ensure the withdrawal of all foreign forces that threaten our security. These steps are essential for Rwanda's stability and lasting regional peace. Once these conditions are met, Rwanda will adjust its defensive measures accordingly. We urge the DRC to engage genuinely in the EAC SADC peace process and call on the international community to support these Africa-led initiatives rather than imposing counterproductive measures. If sanctions or punitive measures were the solution to this region's problems, Rwanda would be the first to support them. However, history has shown otherwise. These only deepen division and undermine regional peace efforts. To conclude, Mr. President, Council members, Rwanda remains guided by the firm belief that our region's future depends on unity, shared prosperity, and inclusive peace. The historical and cultural ties between our communities hold untapped potential, and we hope that through dialogue and cooperation, we can bring lasting peace and development this region desperately needs. I thank you.
我感谢卢旺达代表的发言，下面我请安哥拉代表发言。
Mr. President, thank you for giving us the floor. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, we acknowledge the presence of Her Excellency Therese Kayekwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Francophonie from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and His Excellency Ambassador Ernest Raimusillo, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda to the United Nations. We thank Mrs. Bintou Keita, Special Representative of the Secretary General in the DRC and Head of United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in DRC, and Mr. Wang Shi, Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the Great Lake region, for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, we are holding the third Security Council emergency meeting in less than a month to address the situation in eastern DRC as the M23 continues widening its offensive and making significant military advances in Nord-Kivu and Sud-Kivu provinces, despite calls by this Council, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and other actors in the international community to halt its operations. Angola firmly and unequivocally condemns and repudiates these actions, which can have unforeseen consequences for regional peace and security if not stopped now. We are very concerned with these latest developments and reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities, the withdrawal of M23 from occupied areas, as well as the end to the establishment of parallel administration in the DRC territory. In line with the UN Charter, the international law, and the principle of sovereign equality of all member states, the sovereignty, independence, and unity and territorial integrity of DRC must be respected and upheld. Angola calls on the parties to the conflict to respect international humanitarian law and international human rights, protect civilians, internal displaced people's camps and medical camps, and safeguard the integrity and safety of peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel. Attacks against civilians and peacekeepers constitute war crimes, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. As any other country, DRC has the right to live in peace and security to achieve sustainable development. This Council has the responsibility to assist the people and the government of DRC to achieve these aspirations by acting swiftly and decisively to prevent further escalation of this conflict and promote its peaceful resolution through the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We call on members of the Security Council to work expeditiously to adopt a resolution, namely urging the immediate and unconditional ceasefire and cessation of hostilities, and the peaceful resolution of the conflict through the Luanda and Nairobi processes, in line with the communiques of the joint East African Community and SADC Summit of Heads of State and Government, convened on 8 February 2025, and the Peace and Security Council of the African Union meeting at the Heads of State and Government level, held on 14 February 2025. Mr. President, on 14 February, His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, who was mandated by the African Union as chair of International Conference on Great Lake Region to ensure mediation of the crisis between DRC and Rwanda, presented a report to the Peace and Security Council of the African Union outlining his efforts to achieve peace to this protracted conflict. He stressed that the progress made under the Luanda process must be preserved and upheld, which include the declaration of ceasefire of 4th August 2024, the adoption of the harmonized plan for the neutralization of the FDLR and the disengagement force lifting of defense security measure by Rwanda, the adoption of the concept of operations, CONOPS, and the operationalization of the reinforced ad hoc verification mechanism. Please note that the only pending matter to finalize and consolidate the draft peace agreement proposed by the mediator is the divergency regarding the resolution of the M23 issue, which falls within the scope of the Nairobi process. It is important to emphasize that the M23 issue is not objectively and directly part of the Luanda process mandate, since it has always been understood that the matters relating to the different armed groups operating within DRC should be dealt with within the framework of the Nairobi process. His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço has reiterated time and time again that the conflict and security challenge in the eastern DRC have no military solution and urged the parties to return to the negotiating table immediately. He continues making diplomatic efforts in favor of peace and stability in the DRC, now in a new and additional role as the chair of the African Union since 15 February 2025. At the sidelines of the Peace and Security Council meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on 14 February, he met His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda, and yesterday in Luanda, Angola, he hosted His Excellency Felix Tshisekedi, President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, to discuss the way forward. We call on the international community and the Security Council to continue supporting the ongoing regional initiatives to enhance coordination, harmonization, and complementarity between Luanda and Nairobi process to promote African solutions to African problems. Mr. President, a speed and unconditional de-escalation of the conflict and the genuine and renewed engagement of the parties to explore ways of overcoming the pending issue are paramount to create a political environment conducive to a peaceful solution under the Luanda and Nairobi processes. We encourage all the parties to avoid any actions or rhetoric that can further escalate tensions, including provocative language or inflammatory public statements, since they are counterproductive to the diplomatic efforts to achieve lasting solution to this conflict that has prevailed for so long. As His Excellency President João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço stated during the Peace and Security Council of the African Union meeting, and I quote, "It is only makes sense to continue the peace effort in the eastern of DRC if there is serious engagement from the parties and coherence regarding the commitments made, so that the time and energy are not wasted on actions that have been undertaken to restore peace to this attacked sister country." End of quote. I thank you for your attention.
我感谢安哥拉代表的发言，下面我请肯尼亚代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Kenya congratulates the People's Republic of China on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of February and commends Algeria for its stewardship in January. We also thank the briefers as well as Minister Wagner of the Democratic Republic of Congo and my colleague peers from the region. Mr. President, Kenya is concerned. Kenya is deeply concerned over the escalating unrest in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which imperils the stability of our entire Great Lakes region. The loss of lives of civilians and peacekeepers and the displacement of persons that characterize the conflict compound the already dire humanitarian situation in Eastern DRC. We reiterate the call of the joint EAC SADC summit for an immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities by all the conflicting parties and the withdrawal of foreign actors from the DRC. The attendant effects of the unrest remain dire for the entire Great Lakes region. Widespread displacement of persons, an influx of refugees, the spread of infectious diseases, and increased arms proliferation. In addition, the threat of terrorism posed by ISIS DRC risks burgeoning as the group leverages the unrest to advance its nefarious activities. Mr. President, Kenya is the current chair of the East African Community, and it reiterates the joint EAC SADC summit's position to advance a political rather than a military solution in addressing this conflict. In this regard, we reaffirm our commitment to the Nairobi-Luanda process as the most viable framework for dialogue and reconciliation. We also urge the parties, all parties, to exercise political goodwill and genuinely engage in mediation. We call upon our dear neighbors, DRC, Rwanda, and all others to please tone down the finger-pointing and give dialogue a chance. It is in our collective interest as a region. Please let's tone down the finger-pointing and give dialogue a chance. It is in our collective interest as a region. Whereas Kenya remains committed to supporting diplomatic efforts to restore stability in Eastern DRC, the international community must do more. We therefore call upon this Council to act decisively to contain the prevailing unrest. We must put an end to the death and humanitarian suffering of local populations. UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations must be given unhindered access. On our part, Kenya remains committed to all efforts that will bring peace and stability, not just to Eastern DRC, but to the entire Great Lakes region. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢肯尼亚代表的发言，下面我请布隆迪代表发言。
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi tout d'abord d'exprimer notre reconnaissance à la République populaire de Chine, qui assure la présidence de ce Conseil pour le mois de février, pour avoir convoqué cette troisième réunion en un mois sur la situation en République démocratique du Congo. Cette initiative témoigne de l'engagement de la République populaire de Chine envers la paix et la sécurité dans la région des Grands Lacs et son rôle de leadership au sein du Conseil de sécurité. Nous tenons à remercier Madame Bintou Keïta, représentante spéciale du secrétaire général des Nations Unies et chef de la MONUSCO, et M. Xia, envoyé spécial du secrétaire général des Nations Unies pour la région des Grands Lacs, pour leur présentation riche en informations sur la situation en RDC. Je tiens à saluer particulièrement Son Excellence Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères de la RDC et les collègues qui sont ici présents. Le Burundi tient tout d'abord à rappeler qu'il se trouve en RDC dans le cadre strictement d'un accord bilatéral conformément au communiqué de presse de la FDN du 20 mai 2023. Monsieur le Président, le Burundi, fidèle à ses principes de paix et de solidarité, demeure profondément préoccupé par la détérioration de la situation en RDC. La persistance des conflits, particulièrement à l'est de la RDC, la prise de Goma par le M23 soutenu par le Rwanda et l'occupation prolongée de vastes zones par des forces étrangères constituent une menace grave pour la stabilité régionale. Cette situation met en lumière les limites et faiblesses de nos mécanismes de paix actuels. Et il est impératif que la communauté internationale prenne des mesures immédiates pour prévenir une guerre régionale. À cet égard, le Burundi propose un plan de paix en 5 points qui s'articule autour des principes de dialogue, de coopération régionale et du respect des souverainetés nationales. Nous croyons fermement qu'une solution durable au conflit en RDC nécessite une action collective, urgente et coordonnée. Voici les éléments clés de notre plan de paix. 1. Mobilisation internationale pour éviter l'escalade du conflit. Il est impératif que la communauté internationale, y compris les Nations unies et les acteurs régionaux, s'engagent de manière urgente pour prévenir l'escalade du conflit en RDC et exercer les pressions nécessaires sur les acteurs impliqués dans l'agression de la RDC en violation des principes cardinaux de la Charte des Nations unies, notamment la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de la RDC, ainsi que son indépendance politique en vue d'obtenir des actes concrets. Si aucune action immédiate n'est entreprise, la crise pourrait se transformer en un conflit régional plus vaste, menaçant non seulement la RDC, mais aussi toute la région des Grands Lacs. Nous appelons à une réponse rapide, cohérente et déterminée pour éviter un embrasement régional dont personne ne peut prédire avec précision les conséquences sécuritaires et humanitaires dans la région, avec des ramifications possibles sur les autres régions du continent. 2. Le retrait des forces étrangères non invitées et le démantèlement des groupes armés. Pour parvenir à une paix durable, il est nécessaire que les forces étrangères non invitées, y compris celles du Rwanda, se retirent immédiatement de la RDC et respectent son intégrité territoriale. Parallèlement, la communauté internationale doit soutenir activement le démantèlement de tous les groupes armés, à la fois locaux et étrangers, dont les FDLR, qui continuent de nourrir l'instabilité dans la région. Il est crucial que ces actions soient menées de manière à protéger les civils congolais, qui sont les principales victimes de cette violence. L'inertie et l'attentisme de la communauté internationale nourrit la poursuite des combats et l'appétit de l'agresseur à poursuivre l'occupation des territoires congolais, ce qui pourrait créer un mauvais précédent de nature à pousser les autres États d'user de la force pour grignoter sur les territoires des autres États indépendants sans craindre l'action de la communauté internationale. Un jour de plus, sans action concrète d'arrêter la guerre à l'est de la RDC, équivaut à des centaines de morts de civils innocents, y compris les femmes et les enfants. Non, agissons vite pour être du bon côté de l'histoire. Sinon, en cas d'immobilisme, l'histoire retiendra qu'à un moment donné, la communauté internationale a laissé la situation à l'est de la RDC se dégrader avec des conséquences graves sur le plan sécuritaire et humanitaire. La crédibilité de ce prestigieux Conseil, organe chargé de la paix et de la sécurité internationale, en dépend. 3. Le M23 est la voie du dialogue intercongolais. Quant au M23, il est impératif que ce groupe, s'il se revendique congolais, intègre le processus de paix intercongolais sous la facilitation du président Uhuru Kenyatta, facilitateur désigné par la communauté est-africaine. Ce processus devrait permettre aux Congolais de trouver eux-mêmes des solutions à leurs problèmes sans ingérence extérieure. Nous croyons que le dialogue interne est la seule voie pour arriver à une paix durable en RDC, respectant la souveraineté et l'intégrité du pays. 4. Un cessez-le-feu immédiat et inconditionnel. Nous appelons également à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et sans condition pour permettre l'acheminement de l'assistance humanitaire et créer un environnement propice au dialogue intercongolais. Ce cessez-le-feu serait un premier pas vers une solution pacifique du conflit, réduisant la souffrance des civils, en particulier des femmes et des enfants, qui sont les premières victimes de cette guerre. Une fois respecté, le cessez-le-feu permettra de favoriser un climat favorable au dialogue intercongolais et au retour des déplacés internes et aux réfugiés de retourner dans leur foyer et les élèves à l'école. 5. Renforcement des mécanismes régionaux et internationaux. Enfin, il est crucial de renforcer le Conseil de paix et de sécurité de l'Union africaine et d'assurer un financement suffisant pour les opérations de paix en Afrique. Le Burundi plaide également pour une accélération de l'opérationnalisation de la force africaine en attente afin de permettre à l'Afrique de répondre efficacement à ses propres crises. Une coopération renforcée entre l'Union africaine, les Nations unies et les acteurs régionaux est essentielle pour garantir une réponse cohérente et efficace face à ces défis. Monsieur le Président, le Burundi réaffirme son engagement envers la paix et la stabilité en RDC et dans la région des Grands Lacs. Nous croyons fermement que seule une action collective et une coopération internationale renforcée permettront de surmonter les défis auxquels la RDC est confrontée. Nous appelons tous les membres du Conseil de sécurité à soutenir ce plan de paix dans un esprit de solidarité et de responsabilité partagée pour garantir un avenir pacifique et prospère pour tous les peuples de la région. En définitive, le Burundi, comme beaucoup de pays africains, soutient le projet de résolution REV 2 en circulation sur la RDC dans sa version actuelle et appelle tous les membres du Conseil de sécurité et tout particulièrement, je dis bien tout particulièrement les A3, à savoir l'Algérie, la Sierra Leone et la Somalie, de le soutenir pour respecter le souhait de l'écrasante majorité d'Africains qui condamnent la violation flagrante de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de la RDC. Aucun pays, aucun peuple ne souhaiterait que son territoire et sa souveraineté soient violés au grand jour, au vu et au su de tout le monde. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
我感谢布隆迪代表的发言，下面我请南非代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to once again congratulate the People's Republic of China on assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of February. We thank Special Representative Bintou Keita and Special Envoy Huang Xia for their important briefings. And we acknowledge the presence of Minister of Foreign Affairs of the DRC, Her Excellency, Ms. Teresa Kayikwamba Wagner. South Africa wishes to thank the United Nations and its member states for sharing our grief as we mourn the death of our peacekeepers in the Eastern DRC. We express gratitude to all that played a role in the successful repatriation of the remains of our fallen troops. Mr. President, since the emergency meetings of the Security Council on 26 and 28 January 2025, the situation in the Eastern DRC has deteriorated. Despite repeated calls for a ceasefire and restraint, the M23 and its allies continue to capture territories in the eastern region of the DRC. The capital of Nord-Kivu, Goma, as well as other cities such as Bukavu, are now under the full control of the M23. The supply of electricity, water, humanitarian aid, and communication networks have been disrupted, putting the lives of many injured and the displaced communities at high risk. Mr. President, the recent African Union Summit reiterated the need for all of the parties to the conflict to engage in negotiations towards a sustainable political solution. This decision reinforces the outcomes of the seminal joint summit of the East African Community, the EAC, and the South African Development Community, SADC. We believe that the measure of the Luanda and Nairobi processes, as decided by the joint summit, is prudent for a harmonized and coherent approach to dealing with the prevailing situation in Eastern DRC. Both processes must prioritize, as a matter of urgency, addressing the proliferation and activities of armed groups. All illegal armed groups and uninvited armed forces from neighboring countries are an obstacle to peace and stability in the entire region. All key actors must demonstrate political will to put an end to the crisis. For this reason, South Africa strongly urges all parties to the conflict to engage in de-escalation efforts, confidence-building measures, and fulfill the already agreed terms of the Luanda process. This includes an immediate ceasefire, the implementation of the harmonization plan for the neutralization of the FDLR, the disengagement of foreign forces in the territory of the DRC, and for all parties to participate fully in the ad hoc verification mission monitoring the ceasefire. Alongside the ongoing political process, all parties must ensure that humanitarian efforts are unimpeded and essential services are restored in Goma and other affected areas. Should the parties fail to reach any meaningful progress, despite myriad efforts and decisions aimed at bringing about peace and stability, the Security Council must assume its role by taking measures within its mandate to prevent further carnage in the Eastern DRC. The situation in the Eastern DRC requires a set of immediate measures to mitigate further death and suffering, and to end the capture and control of territory by the M23 and its allies. In this context, we look forward to this Council adopting the draft resolution before it, and hope that it will help with the immediate cessation of hostilities and aid the political process. In conclusion, Mr. President, for the African continent to prosper, we need to truly silence the guns and harness our collective efforts towards development-focused solutions to prolonged challenges. Together, let us make a paradigm shift from the battlegrounds of war to the corridors of diplomacy and seek solutions through compromise above the rigid ideologies of war that often seek absolute victories. History has taught us that absolute victories in war are hollow and simply allow for the continuation of conflict in different forms, often for decades to come. The parties to the conflict must choose peace and negotiate in good faith, with lasting peace as the ultimate prize for the sake of the future of the DRC, the Great Lakes region, and Africa as a whole. I thank you.
我感谢南非代表的发言，下面我请津巴布韦代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Zimbabwe appreciates the briefings provided today and welcomes the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, and La Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Her Excellency Therese Kaikwamba-Wagner. The security situation in the Eastern DRC remains a matter of grave concern. That is why our region has devoted significant time and resources to addressing this crisis, recognizing its far-reaching implications for peace, stability, and development, not only in the DRC, but across the broader Great Lakes region. Indeed, some of our SADC citizens have made the ultimate sacrifice in pursuit of peace in the DRC. Recent high-level engagements underscore the urgency of the situation. The SADC Extraordinary Summit on 31 January 2025, followed by the joint SADC-EAC Summit on 8 February 2025, and the African Union Peace and Security Council Summit on 14 February 2025, all reaffirm the importance of African-led solutions. These efforts reflect the principle of subsidiarity. Mr. President, the principal responsibility for maintaining international peace and security rests with the United Nations Security Council. We therefore urge the Council to align its actions with the decisions and recommendations of African-led initiatives. Strengthening these regional mechanisms will ensure a more coordinated, effective, and contextually relevant response. Zimbabwe calls for support to ongoing regional efforts, particularly within the frameworks of the Luanda and Nairobi processes. These initiatives are essential in addressing the escalating insecurity fueled by the insurgencies of M23 and other armed groups. In that regard, Zimbabwe welcomes the ongoing negotiations on the Security Council draft resolution. We hope that its adoption will complement regional efforts to achieve a peaceful solution to the conflict, and we hope that this will happen without any further delay. My delegation wishes to highlight 5 further priorities essential for restoring peace and stability in the DRC. 1, immediate cessation of hostilities and an unconditional ceasefire. Without an immediate and sustained ceasefire, the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the DRC will remain under threat with dire consequences for regional security. 2, withdrawal of M23 and its allies from captured territories, including Goma and Bukavu. 3, withdrawal of all foreign forces present in the DRC without invitation, including from neighboring countries. 4, protection of civilians and facilitation of humanitarian assistance. The ongoing conflict has inflicted untold suffering, leading to widespread displacement and humanitarian distress. It is imperative that humanitarian assistance reaches those most in need, while humanitarian actors are guaranteed a safe and secure environment to undertake their work.
5, ending the illicit exploitation and trafficking of natural resources. Addressing this root cause of conflict is critical to breaking the cycle of violence and fostering sustainable development in the DRC. Further, Zimbabwe strongly condemns attacks against UN peacekeepers and regional troops, which constitute violations of international law and may amount to war crimes. We denounce assault on Sami DRC forces whose deployment was endorsed by the African Union Peace and Security Council in March 2024. Ensuring their safety is paramount. Mr. President, the Security Council must recognize that African-led peace processes offer the most viable path to a lasting solution in the DRC. Supporting the full implementation and harmonization of the Luanda-Nairobi processes is key to restoring stability. We therefore urge the Council to reinforce these mechanisms and ensure that its interventions align and support these efforts. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢津巴布韦代表的发言，我下面请马拉维代表发言。
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first to congratulate China for assuming the chairmanship of the Security Council for the month. I'd like to thank the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Affairs, Cooperation and the Francophone of DRC, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Council. The Republic of Malawi, as a committed member of the African Union and the Southern African Development Community, SADC, is joining shared concerns as advocated by the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, the Eastern African Community, the Economic Community of the Central African States, and other regional and international bodies, and is deeply concerned with the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The ongoing offensive in both North-Kivu and South-Kivu, particularly involving the M23 supported by Rwanda, which has resulted in significant civilian suffering and regional instability. The Republic of Malawi stands in solidarity with the regional and international bodies and supports all efforts aimed at restoring peace, security, and stability in the region. The Republic of Malawi recognizes the complex and multifaceted nature of the conflict in the Eastern DRC and wish to emphasize the importance of a collaborative and inclusive approach to resolving the crisis. We commend the efforts of the African Union, the Eastern African Community, the Economic Community of the Central African States, the ICGLR, and SADC in addressing the situation and working towards sustainable peace. The Republic of Malawi fully supports the resolution aimed at restoring peace in Eastern DRC and echoes the call for all parties to engage in dialogue, cease hostilities, and prioritize the protection of civilians because one death is a life too many to lose. As a party to various regional and international peace instruments, the Republic of Malawi reaffirms its commitment to supporting initiatives that promote peace, security, and development in the Great Lakes region. We urge all stakeholders to work together in a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect to address the root causes of the conflict and ensure a peaceful environment for all. Malawi stands ready to contribute to these efforts and to support all parties' strong desire to pursue long-lasting peace in DRC. This is why Malawi has never hesitated to assist in such situations as a moral obligation. The Republic of Malawi is very concerned about reports of serious violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses by armed groups in DRC, including claims of high levels of sexual and gender-based violence. The Republic of Malawi is equally concerned with a growing number of forcibly displaced persons in eastern DRC because of the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation, and reiterates the need for all parties to pursue dialogue and to amicably resolve the crisis in DRC. On the same tone, the Republic of Malawi deplores any attacks on peacekeepers and humanitarian agents aimed at contributing to peace-building processes in DRC. As a committed member of the AU and SADC and advocate of the principles of other regional and international bodies, the Republic of Malawi calls for an immediate end of such attacks and urges all stakeholders to ensure the safety and security of peacekeepers and humanitarian personnel. Finally, Mr. President, allow me to thank the United Nations, member states, and all those partners who supported Malawi to repatriate the remains of our fallen troops back to Malawi, and those continuing to support peacekeeping operations missions. I thank you, Mr. President.
我感谢马拉维代表的发言。刚果民主共和国国务部长兼外交国际合作和法语国家事务部长卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下要求再次发言，我现在请她发言。
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, depuis des mois, nous écoutons le Rwanda tenter de justifier l'injustifiable. Justifier son agression répétée, sa guerre d'occupation et le pillage de nos ressources. Aujourd'hui encore, nous avons entendu le représentant rwandais essayer de légitimer non seulement les attaques du Rwanda contre la République démocratique du Congo et son peuple, mais aussi ses attaques contre l'architecture juridique même de cette organisation. Nous avons écouté le Rwanda chercher à légitimer sa guerre après le déplacement de millions de civils, après le pillage de nos ressources par centaines de tonnes et même après l'assassinat de dizaines de casques bleus et de soldats de la paix africains. Je rappelle à ce Conseil que hier, le haut-commissaire aux droits de l'homme a documenté des exécutions sommaires d'enfants par la coalition RDF M23 à Bukavu. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, tenter de justifier l'exécution d'enfants est si abject et ignoble que cela ne recevra aucune réponse de ma part aujourd'hui. Monsieur le représentant permanent du Rwanda, vous avez déjà perdu le combat de la vérité. Merci.
我感谢卡伊宽巴瓦格纳女士阁下的发言。发言名单上没有其他人，现在休会。